Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really lovely to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming to our side event. My name is Ashana Puri Hertz. I'm a program officer leading the climate change and ecosystem thematic area at SwedBio, which is a biodiversity program for equitable development hosted at Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. Yeah, it's very lovely to be here in Cali and to be able to see you all here gathering here for our side event on inclusive conversations exploring the role of a human rights-based approach for biodiversity and climate actions. So what we're going to do today is that we would really like to share with you the outcomes. So we have been SwedBio together with BES-Net, so BES-Net is a biodiversity and ecosystem network and partnership initiative by UNDP, UNEP-WCMC and UNESCO, together with CDKN, the Climate Development and Knowledge Network, Focali, and also Soka Gakkai International, and of course SwedBio. We have been doing a dialogue, what we call a dialogue process, where we engage with many different actors to understand what a human rights-based approach means and how it can be applied best for biodiversity and climate actions. So today, we will be hearing from our participants of this dialogue process about the outcomes and also the key takeaways that they basically gathered from these multi-actor dialogues. But before we get to that, I would like to introduce Nela Cernota from OHCHR here to give us her opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. This one. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Nela Cernota from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, where I support the environment and climate change team. And OHCHR has been supporting this dialogue process since its very beginnings and has participated in most of the sessions, starting in Nairobi and then the online sessions also in Bonn, and we're very, very happy to be part of this dialogue. For me personally, it's been a very valuable experience because I could learn from different stakeholders who have been active in working on biodiversity and climate action, and including those who live most closely and have the closest connection with biodiversity and with nature in general, and who also take care of it. And it was a great experience learning about many positive practices, for example, about instances where states recognized and secured the rights of indigenous peoples as well as of local communities, and where these communities were able to protect nature better and obtain better outcomes for not only themselves but also for biodiversity. But also I learned from the participants about very serious human rights violations that happen in the context of conservation, indeed egregious violations which tell us that we have really still a lot of work to do to ensure human rights in the context of climate and biodiversity action. And the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework does recognize this close connection between human rights and biodiversity, and sets out that the implementation of the framework should follow a human rights-based approach. And OHCHR and partners have developed some guidance on integrating human rights into biodiversity and climate action. For example, the Environment Management Group of the UN of which we are a part. It's an interagency UN group that coordinates and cooperates on environmental matters, published a guidance on integrating human rights into NBCEPs, and it's a guidance that, for example, recently the Human Rights Council took note of in a recent Human Rights Council resolution that we're very excited about. There's a new Human Rights Council resolution on biodiversity and human rights, which recognizes the interconnection between biodiversity and human rights, and starts this important work stream also in the context of the Human Rights Council. It also highlights the important role of environmental human rights defenders in the context of biodiversity, and talks about the links between discrimination and inequality in the context of biodiversity loss and climate change. So it's a very important resolution that we're very happy that Colombia and Costa Rica, who were the core group, brought and tabled at the Human Rights Council, and that states adopted without a vote. And well, now it's time for COP16 to build upon the strong achievements of COP15 and operationalize this human rights-based approach and ensure that it's well implemented. It should consider human rights throughout its decisions. For example, climate and biodiversity action needs to be consistent with human rights and needs to be gender responsive, and COP16 has the opportunity to incorporate this language, and there is already some strong human rights language in the decision concerning climate change and biodiversity. All biodiversity-related financial flows need to be consistent with human rights. That's a particularly important issue that concerns not only states, but also private actors. And the private actors have a responsibility to respect human rights. COP16 also needs to uphold the rights of indigenous peoples and the rights of local communities, and needs to adopt a program of work which has human rights at its core, to make sure that it does justice to the important role that indigenous peoples as well as local communities play in protecting biodiversity. And another important decision that will be taken here is on developing new guidance. And one of the topics that used to be previously in the decision, but it has been removed for now, is a human rights-based approach to biodiversity action. And we hope that COP16 can make a decision to develop guidance on this topic, so that we can so that it assists states in integrating human rights into the implementation of the Convent Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. OHCHR has also requested, by the way, in the Biodiversity and Human Rights Resolution, stands ready to provide assistance on integrating human rights into biodiversity and climate action. And we also hope that the dialogue process that we have been supporting helps to advance this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nella, for the really nice remarks. So yeah, before we go into our lovely panelist here, and we will be having also one joining online, I just wondered, we just mentioned dialogue process, multi-actor dialogue. I wonder if this is really clear for everyone. And I mentioned that also very quickly at the beginning. So since May 2024, this group of organizations, as I mentioned before, BES-Net, CDKN, Focali, Soka Gakkai International, and SwedBio, supported by the OHCHR and the Secretariat of the CBD, we have been conducting what we called a dialogue process. So we had several in-person workshops with different actors. First, we had the first workshop in Nairobi with indigenous peoples, with local communities, women, and youth to discuss what it means. And then we had our second workshop with some member states in Bonn in June. And then we had also our third in-person workshops with some representative of international NGOs and also research communities. We had that in June in Oxford. And then afterwards in August, we also had 2 online sessions with all of these actors, but who could not join the workshops beforehand. So all of these in-person and online sessions have culminated into a multi-actor dialogue that took place just right before the opening of the COP16, which was the 18th and the 19th of October, and it happened in Cali, where we gathered all of these different actors who have participated in the previous workshop to allow them to basically talk to each other, understand each other's perspective. That's why it is a dialogue to move forward. And so we're really, really grateful to all the co-organizers and also the participants. The energy that the participants brought into the dialogue was fantastic. And I think I'm not going to say more. I'm going to hand over to my lovely colleague who's moderating this panel session, Nadia Citas from CDKN. I think she's going to introduce herself in more detail soon. But yeah, I will hand over to you, and I hope you will enjoy this panel session.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for coming. As Puri mentioned, we've been engaging with different actor groups for a while. You can also see some artistic collection of some of the things that we did together when we were having our dialogue, just some visual representations of what people took away from the conversations. So my name is Nadia Citas. I'm from the Climate and Development Knowledge Network that's based at South North in South Africa. And I'm the ecosystem-based adaptation thematic lead. And ecosystem approaches sit at the heart, sit at the heart of biodiversity and climate action. And a lot of the work that we do is convening these types of conversations. So we see ourselves as a broker of these conversations, and this is one of the ones that we've been embarking on, really to try and understand how we can support different actor groups to integrate and embed a human rights-based approach in the work that they do. But you're not going to hear from me. You're going to hear from an amazing panel of speakers, all of whom participated in one of our different engagement sessions. So we've got Mrinalini Tina Rai, who's the Director of Women for Biodiversity. We've got June Rubis, who's from the ICCA Consortium. We've got Irini Sakellari, who's from C4ICRAF, and she is the coordinator of the youth program there for the Youth and Landscapes Initiative. And we've got Mercy Ambani from Seed Savers Network in Kenya. And we also are joined online. We'll soon flash her up, but we are very thrilled to have Maria Cristina Cifuentes from the government of Colombia, who took part in our workshops. And she's a member of the Peace Team for the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development. She's also the Peace Leader of the NDC team and leader of the Just Transitions Negotiations of Colombia for the UNFCCC. So what we thought we would do is just go through each of the panelists, and they've all essentially got the same question, because one of the key outcomes of the multi-actor dialogue was the importance of plurality and diversity. And this was diversity in terms of knowledge systems, of diverse experiences and practices, and also in terms of concerns. So that's why we brought together this wonderful panel of all women speakers who are involved in the dialogue process. And essentially what we'd like you all to reflect on and to share with the audience here is why human rights-based approaches in biodiversity and climate action are so important. Also to maybe reflect on what it means for you as an actor and working with the different people and partners that you work with on the ground. And also maybe some comments on why these types of collaborative dialogues are really useful for advancing the agenda in a more kind of cohesive and collaborative way. So I'm maybe going to just hand over first to you, Tina, to share some reflections.
Thank you. Let me see. Hopefully everybody's be able to hear me. I'm pretty loud otherwise, and going to be louder here in the room. I thought I'll let the other speakers please talk first and take some points. But thank you so much. I'm going to start what you, Nadia, talked about in the last way about saying that how this collaborative work has happened. And I'm actually going to, unfortunately, sit down here. And I'm going to just take some points from this last meeting that took place. Why collaborative work needs to happen together is to build solidarity. Without solidarity and collective actions together, we will definitely be working in silos. And that is what we have also seen, how the climate, the biodiversity, maybe we should put land. are important to really ensure and embed. Because if you're going to put human rights in one aspect and not have the same baselines for the others to follow, we will always have progress from one side. And I keep telling, like, retheading it from the other side. I really want to contextualize because this year is a very important year, because after missing each other, the three sister Rio conventions, the biodiversity, the CBD, the climate, UNEP-WCMC, and land, the UNCCD, are all coming together. It rarely happens. You have to wait for a long time. And I'm really happy to actually see that the biodiversity one is first. And also because we really are hoping that the discussions that are going to take place at the COP16s will also set a standard for the other two Rio conventions. And human rights is core to that. Also understanding that where the CBD COP15 at least have paved the pathway and recognized human rights as one of the core principles under Section C to ensure that the whole of society, the transparency, the accountability is ensured, to make sure that all the targets of the KMGBF will be fully implemented, and human rights is core to that. Now, what we are really also seeing is that my personal perspective is we also see a huge influx of people at this COP. It's one of the largest COP ever. And I'm really happy to see the interest from people here. And I am noticing actually a lot of people also is saying that I think we've also pulled this time a lot of crowd for the climate negotiations. Let me just take a quick check on this. How many of you have actually, is this your first COP? Like how many have you? Okay. How many of you actually go to the climate COP? Okay. All right. So this is really very important to see some of you also follow both of them because this is really very crucial. I'm going to take it from the perspective of the CBD because I'm going to throw up some acronyms and hopefully they're going to be familiar with you. One of the core important elements, the interlinkages between biodiversity and climate, is that the pillars of the CBD, when we always focus, right? We always focus on conservation. What we also need to see that the three pillars of biodiversity is conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. And that's a very complicated issue. Understanding that the Human Rights Council has a new resolution on biodiversity and human rights, was also understanding that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment had also been adopted. And that became a core. So what we are really looking for is that with this, the first COP after the KMGBF is adopted, that every elements, you have, say, for example, items from not only the NBSAP, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which is a core to see the implementation, the monitoring framework, where you have a discussion on indicators, to marine and coastal biodiversity, to invasive alien species, DSI. So what I really want to bring also is that human rights should not also be seen in conservation agenda. Human rights should just be a baseline for any policy on biodiversity or climate action. And maybe, and please do correct me, there may be more climate experts here. One of the examples, and I want to take this platform to really present in that, is I do also follow the climate in some spaces, is going to be what I see is the discussion on just transition, right? Clean energy transition, just transition. And it is very important that this CBD really holds strong on those principles on human rights. So when you're looking at any climate action, I would say that you still really need to make sure that the element that has been set about from a sister convention should not be watered down at the climate negotiations, which is going to take place right after the CBD. Now looking at where I'm coming from, where we have engaged in the CBD and how we are trying to look at that human rights-based approach is through gender. As you all know, that the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has a dedicated target on gender equality. And that has kind of given us one pathway to look at the convention through gender lens. Yeah, because we always say that when you talk about inclusive participation of whole of society, half the population we keep saying are women, but they're not there. So what we're really hoping at the SCOP is that if you're familiar with it, the NBSAPs are very important because like your NDCs or your NAPs, they are going to be having policies and strategies for the governments to take to implement the full Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And within that space is really very important is an indicator. So at COP15, there were a set of indicators adopted for the whole of the KMGBF. I really want you to kind of familiarize yourself because I know that a lot of people are talking about only the KMGBF, but to operationalize the KMGBF, I would say the sister document is the monitoring framework, besides the financial mechanism and national reporting. Now, within that one, what we are really looking forward is, of course, on target 22, where there's a proposal for a land indicator as a headline indicator. But as what we are working for is that there is a component indicator on the national implementation of the Gender Plan of Action to assess the progress that parties would make or actions that they would take to ensure the gender responsive implementation of the KMGBF. So very happy that we came prepared. At COP15, the indicator was adopted. And what the problem was that there was no methodology to prepare. So I'm really happy to see our colleague here from UNEP-WCMC. So together with that, over about a year and a half, we have had a consultative process of developing that metadata. So what we have come prepared at the SCOP is saying that, okay, great, you have a gender plan of action adopted, fine. You have a gender target, okay. You told us that you don't have how to assess your progress. This SCOP, we have come prepared with the metadata for you to adopt for the component indicator. So that is how we are looking at, because the gender plan of action looks also at the human rights. We're talking about environmental human rights defenders. We're talking about funding, capacity building, which are elements of the gender plan of action. So we really hope it's going to be a step forward to having that rights-based approach, inclusive processes, and also actual concrete action to accelerate the work for the KMGBF. Too many acronyms, I'm going to leave it there. And I'll be happy to have any questions from the audience after this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tina. Yeah, there's some space in the front. There may be a few chairs. I don't know if there are some chairs left if people want to come through. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic. We also have some interpretation available. We've got put the QR code back on the screen. If you'd like to scan that, we've got interpretation in English and in Spanish and French. So maybe moving on, we can hear some reflections and thoughts from you, June, if that's all right.
Thank you so much. I just want to say a good welcome and hello, particularly to all my Indigenous brothers and sisters, and also from local communities who are present here today. I'm just going to wait because I see many of my wonderful colleagues from Africa, Latin America, who are here to support this panel, and I wanted them to also hear what we have to say. I don't know how to say that in French or Spanish, but the QR code is for translation. If you could support them so they can understand what we're going to say. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's always great to sit in the panel with amazing, very intelligent people. I'm also really happy that Tina set the tone for the technical perspective. And we're a good team because I'm going to draw us back, and I want us to think more conceptually on why we're here and why we're thinking about human rights-based approach. So I wanted to set the scene in regards of the vision. I think, you know, like before we can, and it's very important, like everything that Tina has shared, it's very important. It gives us a roadmap on how we can work towards, orient ourselves for the COP. But I think in essence, we have to remind ourselves why the human rights-based approach. And my contributions, my interventions for today is based on the many conversations I've had with my colleagues in the consortium, but also in the workshops that we've had, and also recently in Cali. So what I've, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the human rights-based framework is a crucial starting point. It's a very good starting point. It's, as Tina said, as it was birthed, through the Global Biodiversity Framework, and it's a great example for the other COPs. But we have to think about it as more than a legal mechanism. How do we integrate Indigenous peoples and local communities truly into the framework so that it's not just a tokenistic or, like just inviting ourselves in, but we don't really contribute to the essence of the change that we want to see. So, I mean, approaching it beyond, even though it's just as important, individual rights, as my Indigenous peoples colleagues remind me, it's about collective rights. It's about, collective rights and responsibilities. And that's always after the rights. It's a responsibilities towards ourselves and understanding that our survival, our very survival, not just for Indigenous peoples and local communities, but for all humanity, is when we understand it's intertwined with the health of the ecosystems that we currently lived in. So when we think about true equity, we have to address the systemic injustices that continue to shape the global governance systems, including within COP. Our president, Luis Guillermo of the consortium, also reminds me and reminds us that the framework has to evolve to reflect lived realities of the communities. So when we think about inclusion, it has to be beyond assimilation into the existing frameworks and systems, but where can we start to begin to transform the systems to reflect our own values and principles? How can we create space for Indigenous governance structures? How can we operate not just on the legal rights, but understanding it's our deep relationship, whether you're Indigenous peoples, local communities, or just a human being, a deep relationship with land, waters, and with all living beings. And I don't know whether I have some time because I also have been reflecting during my time as co-chair for the Article 8J in Geneva, and there were a lot of pushback. I remember Tina and all of you would remember from some parties when we bring up, rights for environmental defenders. And I think it's also important for us to think critically about the framework, because I think only then we can start to transform the structures that we want to change. So, I mean, I'm a decolonial scholar, Indigenous, scholar. So I always like to think and pick things apart. And I think it's important to remember that the concept of human rights, and I think Kristen also brought it up really subtly in a workshop we had. It's a modern framework. It's part of colonial legacy of human rights, that emerged from the Enlightenment era, which is rooted in Western philosophical frameworks that often exclude non-Western or Indigenous worldviews. So I'm understanding that, and how do we transform? Because as a brother Willie from Congo reminds me, human rights is already part of our DNA. We may not call it human rights, we will call it different names. But the concept of rights and responsibilities is already held within the communities who are protecting the territories. So understanding the resistance of the framework from different parties, also, of course, they would have their own political reasons, but understanding that the resistance also comes with the allies that we sometimes sit with. So for example, the fragmentation of rights and responsibilities, often we tend to separate human rights from the rights of nature. And we have to understand from an Indigenous and local communities point of view is actually together. It's about reciprocal responsibilities and relational responsibilities. So understanding human rights-based framework as holistic and interconnected with nature. And also like the fears of these development paradigms. I mean, a lot of states who push back, my assumption is that they fear that the frameworks will be often tied to, like, for example, Western models of, development or political development, emphasizing on, different market structures that they may not be ready for. So we have to think in the ways when we negotiate, for ourselves, when we talk to the parties or we talk amongst ourselves, how do we get people on board, understanding that we have the same goals? So how do we, for example, sort of also challenge global development paradigms that do not respect local autonomy and, rights to land for Indigenous peoples? So, I mean, I hope this sets the scene for all of us. And when we think about the human rights-based framework, I loved how Tina sort of brings us in and gives us a roadmap on how we can do. But I hope my intervention would help us to remind us of the why we're doing this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. And I think an important reminder in the beauty of bringing different views and perspectives together in dialogue processes, and that each of us come from multiple different actor communities. We may identify as Indigenous peoples, but we could also be women, we can be scholars, we can hold so many different views and opinions, and all at the same time. And the beauty is bringing that together to get a more enriched picture and understand some of the different realities on the ground. So I'd like to hand over to Irini now to share some thoughts, both from the work that you do, but also maybe from being part of the dialogue process.
Hi, everyone. Let me move this a bit closer. It's a blessing, I would say, and I'm super grateful to be here. I am super grateful to follow up on these very wise words we just heard that very much connect with a conversation I had this morning with a friend of mine who is Sami, who was talking about the resistance to the human rights-based approach from both directions, from those that resist them for political reasons, but also those who call it a very anthropocentric perception, without considering that it is actually the indigenous peoples of this forum that have pushed for this language, and therefore it can be nothing less than holistic, nature, culture, humans, all one. So thank you for reminding us that, and thank you also for painting the picture of the bigger policy idea. Before jumping in some reflections from my own work and from the beautiful workshop that I had the luck to be part of these first 2 days of the conference, I just want to recognize a couple of things, maybe without my organization's hat, more from a personal perspective, that we talk about human rights in a land that has been deeply violated by colonialism for many years, that the current people that are here, it's one of the countries with the most murders of environmental defenders. So it's really important to acknowledge that. We are talking about human rights-based approach while genocide is waged in Gaza. We are talking about human rights approach while war is waged everywhere, while militarism is taking place. And I think it's really, really important for any convention that talks about nature, biodiversity, or anything else to acknowledge that we cannot talk about any of these if we don't talk about justice and if we don't talk about peace. So thank you for allowing me to take 1 minute just to say that. And to wear my hat back on, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to work as the youth program coordinator in an organization that has rights at the center of its activities and discussions. We try to make our small contribution, let's say, in changing the narrative on who does conservation, who does restoration, who is responsible for that, who holds the knowledge, to redirect funding to the people that are already building visions in their communities, because that's also a human right, correct? To see the world around you, the landscape around you, and make it something that is good for you, good for your kids, good for the people that will come after you. It was also so interesting to meet in this very safe space that this dialogue was. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that the organizers created a safe space for us to talk as workers of NGOs and IGOs and all of these civil society sector, let's call it, that is professionalized civil society sector, which I'd love to know how many of you work in these spaces, like how many of you work in IGOs or NGOs or some civil society organization, if you want to raise your hand. Beautiful. So maybe you have disagreements or additions with what we discussed in this meeting, but that's important as well. It's nice to have a plurality of voices. But the first thing, and I think it's something we can all take home with us, is that us as NGOs and IGOs and big institutions, global, regional, or national, first and foremost, we have to stop speaking and start listening. I think we have to practice better listening in the sense of listening to our partners and not our beneficiaries. They are not beneficiaries, they are people that are partners. We are partnering with people on the ground, in local communities, indigenous peoples, organizations, grassroots, any type of organizations. These are our partners, and we have to start listening, not speaking for them or over them or thinking they don't have the capacity to speak. So let's try to bring them in all the spaces we go to speak for us, to speak for the cause, because this is the cause we are supporting, right? And this also goes not just in theory, but it has to be a part of praxis. This is something we discussed a lot. And this means resource redistribution for NGOs and IGOs to not be a bottleneck for finance to reach the ground, but the opposite, to invent and reinvent mechanisms that can actually allow for finance to move beyond the upper level, the national level, or the big NGOs level, and actually reach smaller projects in the ground that can scale up, scale out, and scale deep from the ground up. Another thing that I think really connected with human rights that we discussed a lot, and I also already heard the word from my wonderful panelist Judy here, is the decolonization of knowledge, how we produce knowledge, what knowledge do we value, what knowledge do we lobby with, knowledge do we lobby for? And NGOs and IGOs hold immense power in the civil society. We have platforms, we have connections, we have all of these things. So let's practice that, definitely. This was something that came up a lot. Another thing that I think was super interesting, and since I saw at least 20 hands up, is how to hold each other accountable. That for this human rights-based approach to work, NGOs and IGOs have to work together to hold each other accountable. And there have been mechanisms in the past and coalitions. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the coalition, but there was this wonderful lady that has been in the space for more than 20 or 30 years that has said that in the past, all the big conservation organizations, there was a point that they came together and they were kind of holding each other accountable to progress from this fortress, old conservation or restoration moments to something newer, to maybe include the other effective area-based conservation measures or any other, policy language that we want to throw in the table. But basically what they did is move forward together, not try to stick to old practices or necessarily compete with each other, although of course there is the scarcity of funding there. I think another, and maybe the last thing I'd like to bring before wrapping it up, to pass it next to me, is that there was a lot of language in the room. We were different NGOs. Some of us were more, let's say, on the carrot side of making governments do things, and some of us were on the stick side of making governments do things. And the question is, that was brought up, is like, how can we use this variety of activities and plurality of visions and actions on how to make governments listen to us, to actually, again, bring the light to those who I would love to stop calling, unheard or voiceless or marginalized, because they are systemically silenced. And I think that this is important to recognize in the context of human rights. And I think I'll leave it to that. Thank you. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Irini. And an interesting thing, that a lot of the participants were working at different scales and trying to advance this agenda. We had a diversity of actors, and we had member states as participants as well. And that was really interesting to also hear what their needs are. So lots of willing parties that would like to hear experiences of how various people are actually implementing human rights-based approaches and what are the multiple co-benefits of doing it that way. So it was really interesting. And so maybe I'll hand over to you, Mercy, to share some reflections, and importantly, reflecting on the work that you do with actors on the ground.
Thank you so much. My name is Mercy Ambani from Kenya. I work for Seed Savers Network. And coming from agriculture background, largely we deal with women, youth, and basically the indigenous communities. And we've been in this discussion, we've been in the space from Nairobi, and we've had most of the discussions also online. We recently had another one at Alba, and I could say it has been a very good eye-opener, because we have come to an understanding that every actions that we do to mitigate climate change, every action we do to have conservation of biodiversity, they cannot work on standalone. We have rights issue in between. And the rights issue in between comes back to the communities. And it is this, at this time we need to learn and relearn, because it's not from top down, but it can also be from bottom up. These communities have knowledge. These communities have structures, or we had existing structures on how they went about on mitigating climate change. We had mechanisms where we had agrobiodiversity conservation, and now we are moving away. For instance, if I could give an example of Kenya, for us, we preserve indigenous seeds. For instance, like Kenya, we have public institutions whereby they do research, they do breeding of varieties, like now for climate change action. And these indigenous varieties are climate resilient. But then where do they get these varieties? These varieties come from communities. After breeding and coming up with these varieties, they obtain the intellectual property rights. And now the communities are left out. For them to access the varieties that were obtained from them, they have to buy. But they took the accessions from farmers free of charge. That is a right issue. And also, as concerns biodiversity conservation, we have the National Gene Bank of Kenya. That's a very good initiative from the government. But the varieties conserved at the National Gene Bank, where did they come from? They came from the communities. They came from the women who are the good seed custodians. And now when these varieties are at the National Gene Bank, there is free access from profit-oriented companies who come in and they're able to get those varieties, do breeding, obtain intellectual property rights, and then they have to sell it back to farmers. The question is, the farmers who gave out these varieties, are they able to get any monetary value or any benefit? So there are many gaps on biopiracy. There are many gaps as pertains the benefit sharing, and we have free access, we have conservation, but now where do the right issue for the farmers to benefit? The farmers who have been there, the farmers who have been conserving. We have to question, because this dialogue is good because it has been able to help us see that global agreements should be linked to national and should be linked to local level meetings. Because if we have a disconnect, then whom are we going to account to? We have the Nagoya Protocol that talks about benefit sharing. That is very high level. But then when you go to a very local level where we have small scale farmers, who is accountable to them? There is free access, there is free use, but the question is, where does the benefit come from? So this interaction has been so good, and we need now to be inclusive. We need to bring everyone on board. There is no one who should be so much on top, and we are leaving the other indigenous communities at the back, and then we are doing a disservice to certain groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mercy. And so over the many months that we've had these discussions, how can we weave these conversations across scales? How can we connect some of these concerns, and importantly, look for opportunities that we can collectively start implementing? So our final speaker is Zooming in. Unfortunately, couldn't be with us in person, but I'd like to introduce Maria Cristina, who will be providing her intervention online, and hopefully the audio will work for us. Welcome, Maria. Please continue.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Please, could you confirm if you can hear me?
Sorry, Maria Christina, we can't hear you, but I'm going to put the microphone near the computer and hopefully it will work.
Okay. Now, is it better?
That's the mic. It should be from her.
Is it better now? I can't hear you, but could you please confirm if you can hear me? I can't hear you. Okay, I saw. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to this scenario. I would love to be there, but I had to come back to Bogota for this week, and I will be in Cali again next week. We are preparing also everything for the next COP, for the COP of climate change, the COP 29, which is going to be very soon, as one of the speakers said before. But from here, we are still supporting and working very hard every day for all the agenda, logistics, and everything that is going on right now. It's a great pleasure. So on behalf of the government, especially from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia, we are very happy to be in this scenario and to talk about our experience as ministry in the way we are approaching and integrating the human rights approach in the climate action and biodiversity agenda. So first of all, it will be my pleasure to tell you some of the main views that we also were discussing in person some days ago in the multi-dialogue meeting that we had last week with the same organizers of the current event. And most of the views were integrated into the experience that we have had as government. Mainly, I want to highlight that every time we want to integrate a human rights approach, is not going to be an easy task, but it's a mandatory one. And it's necessary to know step by step how we should do so. In the case of Colombia, as many other developing countries or countries where conflict is an issue and a big issue in the country, where all the vulnerabilities and gaps are exacerbated because of this, is a challenging task. But we were discussing in the dialogue that one of the main things that we have to do is starting by integrating everybody, all the stakeholders, to leave no one behind every time we are going to work on a climate action or biodiversity strategy. So what does it mean to integrate everybody? To think about in a differential approach, to think about indigenous communities, in the case of Colombia, Afro-descendant communities, communities from the rural and urban areas, private sector, and also, of course, subnational governments in the way to promote the subnational and local engagement and commitment to develop and fulfill the agenda. So it's important that every time we integrate them or we invite them to be participants of the formulation of the policies or the strategies, we have to consider to develop different and strategic methodologies for each one of the groups from the differential approach. So in the case of the country, we have developed this year the subnational workshops for updating our NDC. And the NDC of Colombia is going to have a special section for biodiversity. So that's one of the ways we are integrating both agendas in a practical way, trying to bring all the elements from the conventions, from both conventions, to the national policy. And for doing so, we have developed some workshops with private sector and subnational governments. At the beginning, we invited different representatives from community. But then we realized, thanks of them, that it's important to separate the scenarios and also think very well about strategically the methodology, the specific methodology that we need to perform. For example, when we talk about and we work with indigenous communities. So there is another process where most of the indigenous communities are going to say always that they do not feel represented by only one or two leaders if they are not participating directly as well. So we have many indigenous communities in the country, and I'm sure that is going also to be the case in all the countries of the world. So it's important that for that case of scenarios, we try to promote the specific participation strategies for them as well, to bring more and more voices to the table and try to make them a part of decision-making processes. So that's the first step to integrate a human rights approach into both agendas. We were also talking in the dialogue about the way we are trying to perform or develop the methodologies, considering the context-specific characteristics of the territories. So, of course, from national perspective, from all the sectors and ministries, we could have our technical perspective, but it's important to go to the territories and also try to enhance the local governments to invite the stakeholders there and see what are the needs and priorities that we need to identify in order to formulate good and adequate policies. So that's super crucial, because sometimes we can search or do a secondary research in order to find the main vulnerabilities and gaps and reports, and we are going to have a result, of course, but it's a completely different to go to the territory and try to update what are the current needs and the current priorities, because they are all the time changing according to the new conditions and new development plans that are going on. For example, in the case of the country, at a subnational level, we have the mayors and governors of Colombia have to formulate a development plan every 4 years. And these development plans should integrate the climate and biodiversity agendas as well, but formulating this with all the stakeholders in the territory. So that's one of the key suggestions that we want to provide today, and also considering what one of our panelists mentioned just a few minutes ago about the importance of linking human rights with peace is crucial as well, considering that for both agendas, and in the case the one that I follow before UNEP-WCMC for just transition, human rights is one of our red lines. So that means that we really demand human rights to be in the text of the decision, of the final decision that is going to be adopted by COP29, and we are not going to continue on a just transition agenda without human rights as the basis of everything, because that is going to allow us to think systematically and from an holistic perspective as well. So when we talk about human rights, we are not only considering those that are directly promoted by both agendas. So that means the right to life, the right to water and sanitation, right to food, right to have proper and adequate livelihoods as well, right of participation, the one as I was mentioning before, right to development, and some others, but also the socioeconomic rights that need to be in presence every time we are discussing these kind of agendas. We can't not fulfill international targets from climate or biodiversity convention without thinking at the same time in promoting socioeconomic rights. That means that for developing countries, it is very challenging to try to force or persuade or invite stakeholders to fulfill the agenda without thinking about the gaps, the poverty gaps and development gaps that we have at the territorial level. So there are many ways to do that, and that's why, or the main reason why I was linking this with the local development plans. because every time the mayors, subnational governments have the chance to promote this kind of holistic development plans and integrate the agenda, they need also to think about the way they are going to work on reducing the poverty gaps at the same time, in order to have more chances and possibilities to promote justice and the human rights approach, guaranteeing all of them, or at least most of them. So that's also crucial. And from the peace and conflict sensitive perspective, it's also important that every time we try to implement a human rights approach in countries where there is an internal conflict or external conflict, as we are seeing nowadays in Middle East and in Europe and in other countries around the world. We have to consider that we not only needs negative peace actions, but also positive peace actions. And negative peace is called like that from the academy, but that it doesn't mean that is bad. So negative peace is more focused in reducing tensions and reducing conflict, and positive peace is more focused in development and enhancing the flourishing of the society. And both of them are necessary every time we are trying to integrate a human rights approach. So we need to think about all these different gaps and the systemic areas or dimensions we have to integrate in order to have a successful strategy from climate action and biodiversity. We have 23 targets in the biodiversity agenda, and we also have many items in the climate change agenda that are super crucial and interconnected, of course, with the implementation of the biodiversity one. But it's important to provide the scenarios and to enable everything that we have to do. So we need enablers. And what are those enablers? What is going to enable the development? What is going to enable the development of a successful human rights approach and justice and so on? We need to think about that. We need to think about who we need on the table to start having this conversation together, and consider integrate everybody in this, and not only for the formulation and implementation, but also in the following up of the implementation as well. So we were going to have some strategies or policies to implement the biodiversity climate action agenda at local level for the, let's say, next 3 years or 5 years. We have to follow up the implementation, and we need to integrate also different stakeholders on this, and especially community, and guarantee that the most vulnerable communities are really being affected, or I mean positively affected or integrated in the implementation of the agenda. So that's the idea. Do not forget to so that sometimes what is obvious, because I have heard that many times, when we say we need to integrate this and this and these types of groups from the community, and many people say, it's obvious. Of course, when we talk about society, everybody is included, but it's not really like that. And we really need to see how and who is included and how they are approaching them. And is really everybody included? And are they identifying their local needs and priorities? How are we going to integrate this in the final result or product that we're going to have as policy or strategy? So that's some of the suggestions that I would like to provide from our experience as governments. And yeah, I don't know if I have more time, but maybe we can answer later more questions.
Maria Cristina. And also just thank you so much for taking time to Zoom in today, and for spending 2 days with us in the multi-actor dialogue, especially as you prepare for this current COP, for the next COP that's coming. It really does show the commitment that Colombia has to advancing the human rights agenda. So now maybe just very quickly whizzing back, because Tristan is going to be our next speaker, but I thought maybe our panelists can give one sentence of the what next. So we gathered here today and this week and the next couple of weeks to look in the global biodiversity framework. Is there one sentence that you would like the audience and those listening to take with them as we have these conversations going forward? So maybe Mercy, starting with you.
Thank you. I will say human rights is a connection for biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation approaches. So it's in between. We may not achieve climate change mitigation approaches without incorporating human rights in it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have around 10 days, I think, to go for COP16. And we heard also COP29 is coming, COP16 for the UNCCD is coming up. Let's use our platform's power, influence, work to elevate, to listen, first to listen to the systemically unheard, and then to elevate their positions. Indigenous peoples have a representation in this COP. Civil society has a representation, women, youth. So yeah, I think that's it. Just use your power to do that.
More multi-actor discussions and networks. Just from the work that I do on the ground in Borneo and Timor-Leste, working with the government, we see a huge change when you engage with the state and also private actors on the ground. Thank you, Tina, for reminding us, not just conservation. I'm a conservation biologist by training, but not just conservation, but right now, access and benefit sharing is a huge thing, particularly for the Global South. So the work that I do on the ground is around biocultural protocols and also educating governments about, free, prior, informed consent, the right to, to say no. So yes, definitely more multi-actor state networks. I just want to quickly share a quick story. We had a woman from Morocco in our workshop, and she started off saying she's not sure about rights because the term rights does not work in her country. And then we had a discussion, and in the last group, and she was saying, you know what, I think it's time to socialize rights in my country. And I'm working with the government on this. So it's a wonderful change to see within that one day of workshop.
Hello. My speech, I'm going to, as we are here at COP16, I'm going to give you all some textual proposals to take back. I'm going to take advantage that all of you are here and you all represent governments or civil society or major stakeholders groups or UN agencies or bingos or ingos or whatever it is. We are talking about the human rights. It is something that, if you are following, is on the biodiversity and climate change. There's a proposal, you may be able to look at some of the proposals the Human Rights Working Group has put onto that, is that as we are talking about it, what we really need to practically do out of this COP16 is to ensure that the human rights is retained every single agenda where it was, including for the parties to ensure that Section C of the KMGBF is addressed. The right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable, I always think about putting safe, it's not there, but the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which is there in some of the documents and are under discussions in brackets. I would really ask that if you're going out from here, with your party delegations, please really make sure that any language on human rights is retained and kept for the outcome so we can take it forward. We may be here, but please do understand that CBD only takes place once in 2 years. If we lose this opportunity here, we want to be able to take this to the climate and the other Rios. So please help us retain the language on human rights in all the negotiations that are taking place between these 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Just maybe to say, Tina mentioned something from the Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group. We can share this. There's a QR code. It's been working really hard over the last couple of years to develop some guidance material. There's some work on from agreements to action, but they've also got some guidance specifically to the agenda items that will be negotiated in the next couple of weeks. So please do, if you are interested, please come and scan that and you can get some guidance there. But maybe to hand over to Tristan Tyrrell now from the Secretariat of the CBD. First off, thank you for all the work that the Secretariat has done to bring us all here together. But maybe you've been a supporter, well, the Secretariat has supported these multi-actor dialogues, and I wondered if you could share some reflections, from being involved in some of those dialogues and maybe how we can collectively take this conversation forward.
Thanks, Nadia, and good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Tristan Tyrrell. I'm the Programme Officer responsible for biodiversity, climate change, and dry and subhuman lands. So COP29 and COP16 as well over the next couple of months. So I'm not part of the HJ, the People's team within the Secretariat. I'm coming from a different group, but I've had the honor of being part of this whole process. And it has been such a learning experience right from the very start. I thought I understood what human rights and human rights-based approaches was, and I was quickly corrected on multiple levels. And even just today, it's just every time throughout this whole process, learning something new, reevaluating my own perceptions and my own sort of prejudgments on how things work. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from this part of the world. I'm from Europe. And so the perceptions on how people relate with the natural environment, how the dependencies and who is engaging, how are they engaging, how are they being engaged with, has I have one perspective, and obviously it's very different from many other people's. And so I really very much appreciated this whole process just on a very personal level. But then coming to the work that we do within the Secretariat, obviously it's a party-driven process primarily. And so it's about supporting the parties in particular to meet what they have committed to doing through their decisions. And of course, at the moment now, it's the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the goals, the 23 targets to be met by 2030, and to putting us on track to meeting the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. And looking at how the wording of the targets and the goals and the overall framework has been put together, yes, absolutely, there are clear biases towards certain worldviews within the wording. But there's also that expectation of national interpretation, how parties themselves are responding to what they have committed to in Montreal 2 years ago, and how they are developing their national targets initially, but then also the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And of course, certainly as part of my work, how they're linking those policy documents to others, whether it's under UNEP-WCMC or UNCCD, or indeed how they link to sectoral development plans, sustainable development plans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's through that yes, we do have this recognition of human rights-based approaches within Section C, the cross-cutting considerations of the framework. But it's also about how does that translate into the action-oriented targets? Where are those considerations coming through? And then how are they being linked to some of these other policies across, given that it's whole of society and whole of government in terms of expectation of implementation. Linked to that, of course, is the consultation processes. Who is engaging? How are they being engaged? Right the way through from the planning process in terms of trying to set those national targets, etc., but then also the implementation of those. And of course, words on paper are wonderful, and we can say many wonderful things, but its action needs to follow that. And of course, within this particular process, but certainly at the national, my understanding anyway, from what I've seen from the national processes, is there are inherent biases as who is part of those discussions. And I am absolutely not criticizing the organizers of this process. I think they've done a fantastic job of trying to reach out to as many as possible, but it's the responses of who actually showed up for these inclusive conversations. And I think it says a lot about who takes a genuine interest in actually thinking about, well, how are we interpreting HRBA as part of GBF implementation? And I'm just looking around the room here. there are a lot more women in the room than there are men. Hi to the rest of you men. But that is a reality. And we made a joke about this in the Oxford event, which was with sort of research and NGO communities. And there were two men. Myself, luckily, was one of them. And then another man from Indonesia. And it just seemed to very much reflect how this is, who engages with this discussion is inherently skewed, and that needs to be corrected. There was also mentioned the private sector, the finance sector, and where is that coming? Them being part of these discussions as well, and thinking about, well, how do we actually get, even if people hear the words human rights and immediately sort of recoil, how do you bring them to the table? How do you make it that safe space, which the organizers of this process have tried to do, very much so, but in a national context, in a subnational context, and then again here now at the international level, thinking about, well, how are we taking away those square brackets from some of these? I should not be discussing negotiated text, so I will restrain myself a little bit. But how do we take that those concerns, fears, potentially misinterpretations of the intention behind some of this off the table, so that it's a genuine, active, progressive conversation, both here at the international level, but especially when it comes to national and in particular subnational implementation of this. We know for a fact that one of the reasons why biodiversity loss is happening at such an increasing rate is because we're making wonderful global targets, going right back to the 2010 targets and then the Aichi targets and now the GBF. They're wonderful at the international level, recognizing there are limitations, but there are some good intentions, but the reality is it's getting that action on the ground, making sure the right people are part of that process and have the capacity to make a difference where the difference needs to be made. And that is part of the challenge. I was taking some notes and I realized that I should have put them in some sort of an order. So apologies that I know I'm going to regret not highlighting something now in a second. But I think within the convention, we do have Article 8J, which has certainly made strides in terms of recognizing and respecting Indigenous peoples and local communities, their rights, their knowledge, their cultures, etc. And I think compared to other multilateral environmental agreements, it's probably stronger than in many others, if not all. But it still needs to be highlighted. It still needs to be brought forward further. And I think again, not to try and influence negotiations, but being part of those discussions where you can as part of this process is very important. Yes, there are the negotiations and trying to see what comes out in terms of the decisions, but it's also holding parties and others, because it is a whole of society approach that is expected to be taken, holding them to account, because they have made commitments 2 years ago in Montreal. They have made commitments in other decisions in the past. Those are still valid and still need to be taken forward and implemented as effectively and with as much positive impact as possible. I just want to thank again the organizers of this process, but also to all of you for being part of this discussion as well, because frankly, we need champions at every level, and hopefully you're all willing to step forward and be part of that need to be talking to people outside of this room, outside of Cali, but also when you go back home in 10 days' time or so. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tristan. And there just really never is enough time. I think we wanted to have a bit more of an engaging session with some question and answers, but we've run out of time for that. But we also ran out of time at the dialogues. We thought people would be exhausted. At 6 o'clock, people were still speaking. We were trying to wrestle the microphones out of hands. But that's really, so we're not finished yet. Please don't leave. We just would like to have some sincere thanks to SwedBio and maybe Sarah Elfstrand, if you could send us on our way. And we've also got food for everybody. So please don't leave before you've collected some refreshments.
Thank you so much, Nadia. So very brief, but on behalf of SwedBio, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to all the participants in the process for sharing their time, knowledge, experiences, and insights into this process. We also want to thank all the co-conveners, BES-Net, Soka Gakkai International, CDKN, and Focali, and also the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Secretariat of the CBD for their support. And as a program on biodiversity and equitable development, SwedBio work in close partnership with diverse actors and partner organizations to address the increasingly urgent biodiversity and climate crisis, and the existential threats that these pose for humanity and undermining human rights. And we take a holistic approach in this, working across policy and practice, in bridging across local to global and connecting actors and knowledge systems, in bridging the separation between environmental action and the protection of human rights, and also in financing HRBA initiatives. And in this, we are guided by the conviction that the most strategic and effective means to conserve and sustainably manage biodiversity and ecosystems while addressing the climate crisis is to depart from a human rights-based approach as an entry point. And we believe that equitable dialogue processes, as this one, underpinned by principles such as respect for diversity, trust, reciprocity, and equal sharing, is an important enabler for a whole of society approach. And so this multi-actor dialogue process on a human rights-based approach to biodiversity and climate action has been, for us, a significant process for collectively advancing the understanding of how a human rights-based approach is conceptualized, co-designed, and applied in biodiversity and climate action. And yeah, this is critical for the synergistic implementation of both the KMGBF and the Paris Agreement across all levels. And so we are very grateful for this collective process co-created together with the co-conveners and with all the participants. And we believe that through this, we have deepened the shared understanding of what a human rights-based approach to biodiversity and climate action means, and also gained momentum together to further advance and amplify a human rights-based approach. And we look forward to continue this process together during the COP and also beyond. But we also want to stress the need for more resources, more actors to engage in this cause, as a message coming out from the process was the urgent call for further action now. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And that concludes the agenda here. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking these conversations forward into the spaces where you're going. I see there's a hand going up. I'm just going to be cheeky and say, sure, if you want to say something, but please, we've got refreshments and food. Please grab something before we go so we don't waste any food.
Thank you. I have a burning question, and it would be unfair for me to come from Uganda and come here and not ask this question. Probably the panelists can give me some of the answers. Speaking about human rights-based approach, and well, there was a lot of emphasis on it, and one of the things that was not emphasized is the rights of the people that are defending biodiversity, the rights of the communities that are on the front line, and they are the people that are supposed that are and that we need to defend. Well, you look at everywhere. Global Witness released a statement, and Colombia was one of the countries that have defenders dying, being threatened, being criminalized for defending biodiversity. That is happening in Uganda. It is hosting one of the longest pipeline that runs from Uganda to Tanzania. And we have defenders, young people from the university who are standing up, who are protesting against the pipeline and are being threatened. Right now, 158 university students are facing criminal charges for defending biodiversity. We have community who are on front lines and again, also are being in addition to their land being taken away, in addition to their biodiversity being in on the edge of being destroyed by the oil activities, still they're also facing criminal charges. How can we establish human rights mechanism to defend, to hold governments, to hold financial institutions that are funding those projects that are distracting the biodiversity, and also the corporations that are destroying these ecosystem areas? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think everyone can probably reflect on where they come from, and these violations are happening in many parts of the world. So I don't think Uganda has a unique experience, but it's really important to address those. I'm not sure if there's anyone from the panel. June, would you like to? Please go ahead.
I mean, absolutely, and thank you so much. I mean, that was really a powerful reminder. I mean, and of course, we're thinking about Target 22, about environmental defenders. I suppose well, I guess I'll speak for myself. When we think about collective rights, we think about those defenders as well, because the defenders are not defending one person, or they're defending an entire community. They're defending land and territories. And I think about, I mean, I can't answer your question right now about what the mechanisms would look like, but I think when we call for collective rights, we definitely include environmental rights defenders, and we have to hold the line and hold parties responsible in acknowledging that, you know, when the defenders are attacked, you're attacking the entire community, you're attacking territories and the ways of life. But thank you. I love that you really emphasized that and brought us of the reality of many communities on the ground everywhere. Thank you.
Sorry, we are supposed to end, but I will also add something. Thank you so very much. And I want to quickly just end on this one, the saying that it's only the drivers of biodiversity loss. But if you're going to be looking at the background of why it's happening, you'll also see climate projects being part of that. And that is the reason why we're seeing is that it's not only biodiversity loss and biodiversity human rights defenders, it's environmental human rights defenders. And we really need to see, because a lot of the projects are either for agriculture, for corn, or for carbon sinks, right, or protected areas. They have these, so that's what I'm saying. It's about time that we kind of look at this intersectionality between the two. Say, for example, in Asia, where I come from, the biodiversity loss is happening, but it's got to do with dams. For what? For clean energy, right? So you have to really be looking at how development projects, guided by the aspirations of being carbon neutral or nature positive, has a compounded effect. So we really need to kind of broaden our perspective of not looking at silo by saying that these are, you know, environmental defenders by biodiversity because they were protecting a forest. Well, maybe they were protecting a forest because the projects were trying to cut the forest to have a mining or for having cobalt. I mean, it's Africa, right? A lot of the mining is not for protected area, but it's also got to do with transitional minerals, which is kind of a commitment at the climate and not actually the biodiversity. So I just want to encourage people to let's not look at just a one single package, but seeing that how that is the reason why that each one of them is complicating that issue. And we really need to kind of look at it through this holistic, collective issue at the problem and how we can solve it. So hopefully that'll also help.
I'm sure there's so many more questions, but we are going to have to vacate the venue so that the next speakers and session can start. But please find our speakers, ask them questions. We'd love to continue this conversation going on beyond the COPs and into next year. So please do keep in touch, but please first help yourself to some food and meet some new friends.